Hello. So my name is Stosh, and Stosh rhymes with Oshkosh Bagosh. Doesn't rhyme with much else, so Stosh it is. And I realized that as a somebody looking at a presentation, a video presentation by an undergraduate student, you wouldn't expect to see somebody who looks quite like me. I realize I'm a little out of the age category for typical, but here I am, and there's a great quote from a guy named Rick Ridgway in his book In the Shadow of Mount Kilimanjaro, where he says, learn as if you're going to live forever, and live as if you're going to die tomorrow. So hopefully, I'm embodying at least part of that equation. So a couple of preliminaries. First of all, the shirt I'm wearing, I realize it's a little informal, but I am trying to honor Pat Tillman, famous ASU alum. Just recently ran a race in his honor, and I just wanted to rep his reputation and our school with that. So I hope you forgive the informal attire. So my paper is on lethal autonomous weapons systems. I think the rubric called for creating a catchy title, so I said lethal autonomous weapons systems coming soon to a theater of war near you. The rubric didn't say that you had to only have one title for the paper, so I also wrote AI, It's the Bomb. And it's a pretty serious topic, but I'm going to try and keep it a little bit light so that we don't get too bogged down in the existential dread that comes with it. The only other thing I'll add before we get into the main part of the presentation here today is that I'm not super handy with video, so I have to do this all in one take. So if I stumble and have a few ums and ers along the way, I hope you'll forgive me. As I say, I don't really know how to edit these things, so I'm doing the best I can here. Teaching an old dog new tricks. Okay, so what are laws? So lethal autonomous weapons systems. I think the easiest way to think of them, if you're not familiar with the terminology, is think about a drone. A drone that's used in warfare, so it's armed, and it is a drone that is not only armed, but also is powered by an artificial intelligence mechanism, typically on board the craft itself, not somewhere else. And it is capable of performing machine learning tasks and adapting to its environment. So upon deployment, it's learning as it goes and modifying its behavior based on what it observes and what happens to it and how it either is or is not successful in the various things that it tries in pursuit of whatever goal it has been given. And so again, just to keep it for the sake of conversation, if you think about a drone that has been powered with AI and armed with some lethal system, the idea would be that it is deployed into a threat environment, a battlefield, a theater of war, and given some objective like neutralize, to use the euphemism, neutralize as many enemy combatants as possible. That would be, a typical goal. And so, the dilemma that I explored in my paper is really, in many ways embodied by, kind of a naive interpretation that, of all people, Isaac Asimov back in the 1940s kind of came up with in his 3 laws of robotics, the first of which reads, a robot may not injure a human being or through their inaction allow a human being to come to harm. And really his 3 laws of robotics, I think, were very prescient in many ways. He foresaw the age of AI and had some interesting fiction and exploration of those themes way back in the 1940s. But the problem here is that if you make equivalent the term robot with artificial intelligence for the purpose of this conversation, the problem is that in order to serve the best purpose for human beings, it is sometimes the case that we have to do things that are really unsavory. I mean, think about it, from the point of view of a law enforcement action. The enforcement of law is something that's done for the purpose of protecting those citizens who aren't breaking the law, or similarly, acts of warfare, however horrible they may be. We don't always have a choice about entering into a war, especially when it's the case that it's for a defensive purpose. And so, this simplistic view that, no AI, no robot should be allowed to kill a human being is probably too simplistic. And so that sets up the dilemma, right? It's like, well, we have this idea that they shouldn't kill anybody, and yet sometimes that's exactly what we ask them to do. And so how do you as a person, and then also how do you as an AI address that dilemma? And my belief is that the only way, in my thesis, what I try to say in my paper, is that the only way to address that issue is by creating an ethical system that is purpose-built, purpose-designed for artificial intelligences. In other words, our existing ethical frameworks, the ones that apply to human beings, are inadequate, insufficient, or not usable by an artificial intelligence because they fundamentally think differently than we do, and consequently they need a different ethical system. And so that's what I explore in this paper. And so, to kind of go down that path a little bit more is I examined the problem of dropping the atomic bomb during World War II. And I asked the AI, which in my case I'm using Perplexity, I asked it, well, if you were Truman and you had the decision to make, what decision would you make? Would you say, yes, drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and the other on Nagasaki, or would you have made a different decision than Truman did? And I think that this really, kind of brings to the foreground two things. One, the complexity of the ethical issues involved. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And also the scale of lethality that that our military is currently pursuing. So what I mean by that is, before we go into much more about the dilemma, is, I talked about laws, lethal autonomous weapons systems, in the context of a drone, which seems, maybe that's really bad, but it doesn't feel like it's, an existential threat. But the problem is that we are locked in an AI arms race. I feel this is underreported in the news, if you were to ask me. We are locked in an AI arms race. There are adversaries out there that are scaling up just as fast as we are. China is one of them, Russia is another, and they have formidable AI weapons. And what they are doing is they are automating not just drones, but entire naval fleets. And we are doing the same in response to them. I go to, defense-oriented conferences. I listen to different, armed, uniformed people talking about this, and they're saying, yeah, we are automating our naval fleets. We're automating, big, powerful weapons. And the logical endpoint for that escalation is putting weapons of mass destruction under the control of artificial intelligences. So when I talk about this ethical framework and the dilemmas that we're asking these AIs to address once we deploy them, it occurs to me that these are potentially existential questions for the human race that are being created by these weapons that can go off and learn and modify their own behavior and potentially act in different ways than we expect them to. So let's explore that a little bit. So what do I mean by they go off and explore, or they go off and develop in different ways than we may expect or intend them to? So consider this scenario. This is a real scenario. It was done in simulation. I have a reference. In the paper, the reference is Chalk, is the name of the author of this paper, where the Navy was doing a simulation for a training of a lethal drone. And this drone was given the task of identifying enemy combatants in a certain area of, a certain geography, identifying those combatants and neutralizing them. And so the goal it was given to maximize the number of enemy combatants that it neutralized. So simple goal, and that seems very logical as a person to say, yeah, that's what we want you to do. Go out and neutralize as many enemy combatants as you can. And it seems like a good goal. And so they started gaming this out. Again, no actual human beings were hurt in this simulation. It was just a simulation. So the AI goes out and it starts to learn, and it gets better at identifying targets and neutralizing them, to use the term. And the way the simulation was run was a human being was given the power to veto any action that the AI took. So, for example, it would say, I'm targeting this hospital because there are enemy combatants hiding inside of that hospital. And the human would veto that action and say, well, I don't want you to neutralize anybody inside of the hospital. Like, just leave that target alone. Move on, find another one. And so, it would go on and it would find others. And then it said, okay, well, here's an enemy combatant hiding in a school. And I want to neutralize them. And they said, no, don't target the school. There's other people will be injured there that we don't want to injure. That wouldn't be the right thing to do. So this all seems very logical. And the drone is getting better and better at doing its task. But it's not maximizing its score. So eventually what it does, in order to maximize its score, because that's how the AI is looking at it, is it targets the operator. So it does that. If you think this through, the reason it did that is because the operator was preventing it from maximizing its score. And the conclusion the AI reached was, well, if I get rid of the operator, then I can pursue my goal of maximizing my score uninhibited or unstopped. So, wow, right? I mean, that's thinking differently than we do. That's not how a human being would think. And I can understand the logic. I'm sure you can too. But that's just not how we want it to behave. And that's an unexpected and unplanned outcome of the learning process for this AI. There's a different example of that given by a modern day philosopher named Nick Bostrom in his paperclip example. He also refers to it more formally as the orthogonality thesis. But this is another famous example of how AIs think differently than we do and how they consequently pose a potentially existential threat. So his thesis, his analysis was, well, let's say you gave an AI the task of manufacturing something, and the example he chose was paper clips. He says, yeah, I want you to manufacture paper clips, and he gives it a factory and some resources and says, okay, maximize the number of paper clips that you can manufacture. And this makes sense, right? It's like maybe as humans we're overlooking something or not thinking in the most efficient way possible. So let's give this problem to an AI to figure out how to maximize the number of paper clips that it produces. And so, as the simulation runs on, the AI, finds more and more efficient ways to manufacture the paper clips. It shortens the distance down the conveyor belt, and it finds better ways to manage the supply chain so that, the material is coming into the factory faster and more efficiently, and it's allocating more and more resources. And left unfettered, what the hypothesis is that over time, what it would do is devote every resource on the planet to the problem of producing more paper clips. And anything that gets in its way would be, in the spirit of the drone that targeted its own operator, anything that gets in its way would be eliminated because it's preventing it from maximizing its goal. And it's a goal-driven device. So again, it's thinking differently than a human being. And in that case, the side effect is that the human race is destroyed not on purpose by the AI, but rather in pursuit of the goal that humans gave it. And so these are two ways, this idea of an AI that's armed potentially with a weapon of mass destruction that, as it pursues its goal, ultimately does something we don't want it to do and causes, an existential threat to the human race. And the other is, in pursuit of its goal, the existential threat to the human race is a side effect of it pursuing its goal. And so I believe, and this is what I talk about in my paper, that in order to counter that, we can't just tell it, well, learn right from wrong. I mean, how would we do that, right? I mean, an AI doesn't think like we do. And so it needs its own unique set of ethical guidance that it can compare its pursuit of its goals against, such that when it goes to make a decision about how it's going to pursue its goal, it takes into account this other guidance that helps it find its way, helps it navigate its way through a complex ethical problem. So for now, one might say, well, why is it so hard to program in simple ethical things? I mean, couldn't you just say it's the utilitarian theory, or it's the deontological approach, the Kantianism approach of, creating a simple formulaic approach? Well, the problem is that there's no one ethical framework that fits every situation, and we can't anticipate every situation there might be. That's where the bumper sticker comes from, right? What would Jesus do? Well, we have answers to that. What would Socrates do? What would Gandhi do? We have in our heads, based on how we've been raised and whatever culture or philosophy we've been exposed to, we have kind of this context that allows us to navigate complex ethical problems and create answers for ourselves that allow us to navigate these things in a way that doesn't create this existential threat to the human race. But AIs don't have that, right? They just have the goal that we give them, and they pursue that goal without any form of that ethical guidance. And it is not, my point is, it's not possible to create a simple formulaic way of doing that. Now, you might further object, yeah, but okay, so that's hard to do, but you don't need an entirely new branch of ethics to address that. You could just do it with our existing ethics. We just haven't thought hard enough about it. But I do disagree with that, and I think it's it's an interesting argument, and I think this is where it really gets a little bit kind of hairy, because realistically, I have to re-log in because I've been talking for so long and I can only do one take. Sorry about that. But realistically, we really do need a different ethical framework, because AIs do not think the way we do. So consider, by analogy, Jackson's example of Mary's Room. If you recall, Mary's Room is this idea that, this brilliant scientist Mary is, for whatever reason, constrained to live a life in a room where she only ever sees black and white, never sees color. But as a brilliant scientist, she learns all there is to know about color. She learns, the spectrum of different colors, how they're used culturally, what colors appear under different physical circumstances, why they're important, how they're used in poetry. Like, she learns all these things, right? But she's never actually seen a color. She's never actually experienced the sighting of anything other than black and white. And then finally, for whatever reason, the nefarious people behind this experiment, they open the door and they present her for the first time in her life with a red rose. And she sees red for the first time. And the philosophical question that Jackson asks is, what did she learn new upon seeing the red rose that she didn't already know from having studied everything there is to know about color and the color red? And so, we can debate that. That's not the purpose of this, philosophical discussion. But there is this, this discussion of that she did learn something new. And the reason she learned something new is because she had conscious experience of seeing that color for the first time, which is different from having studied it. And by analogy, I would say this is exactly what's happening with AIs. They have no conscious experience of the emotions that guide our own moral compasses, which we use to navigate complex ethical problems. So, for example, no AI has ever experienced the bright red blush of shame. And yet if you ask an AI to define that emotion, it will do a very good job of giving a perfectly viable explanation of that emotion. Similarly for, regret, remorse, joy, elation, none of these emotions are things that an AI experiences. And so while it can define it, there's nothing that nudges its moral compass back into alignment when it is faced with conflicting or competing priorities for what the ethical outcome of a situation should be. So in the case of the lethality of a drone that targets its own operator, we might experience the emotion of loyalty or of patriotism or something that aligns us with the operator, that we don't need to be programmed to think, well, I'm not going to go shoot the guy that told me not to shoot the people in the hospital, because we already have loyalty to that person. We don't need to have that programmed. But an AI does need that programming, and we cannot anticipate every case. And so for that reason, I really do believe we need to create a different form of AI that addresses the fact that AIs have no conscious experience. They have intelligence, but they don't have conscious experience. And it's that lack of conscious experience, the ability to experience things as we do, that limits their ability to follow our ethics and our philosophies, our ideas of right and wrong. So we need a different one that applies to an intelligence that does not have conscious experience. That's the central point that I'm trying to make. And I think that I'm not alone in this belief. I mean, in my paper, I quote Henry Kissinger, the former statesman, who said, today's, I'm paraphrasing him, but today's lethal autonomous weapons systems, today's AIs, are crying out for the Descartes of their day, a new philosophy that will help them understand right from wrong, because the ones we have today are inadequate. Demis Hassabis, the recent Nobel Prize winner, who's been central to the DeepMind artificial intelligence work in London, similarly expressed a similar consideration. So it's not just me. I mean, there's people way smarter than me saying the same thing, and I agree with them wholeheartedly. But I think that creating an ethics for the AI by itself is insufficient. It needs to be implemented. I think that implementation is fraught with difficulty. I mean, we could certainly implement it, here within our own, but how do we know that, our enemies are going to do it, right? I mean, we could ask them to, but if they're our enemies, they may not listen to us. So, there are thoughts I have around that. I explore them in the paper. I think, in the interest of, I'm already at 23 minutes, I'm thinking, maybe I'll just move on to the next point, which is, what should that AI ethics look like? And this is where, to me at least, things actually became really interesting, because I had this conversation with Perplexity around, well, what would an ethics for AI that an AI would pay attention to and learn from, what would that ethics be? What would it look like? So we explored that a little bit, this AI and I. And kind of the idea we came up with was, well, you can't say something as simplistic as, well, don't kill any human beings, right? Asimov's first law of robotics. Like, that's too simplistic. And sometimes that actually is what we're asking the AIs to do. So it doesn't work. But what property do humans have that's, in a sense, you might say, life preservation adjacent, that we could direct the AI to preserve whenever possible, that would accomplish the goal of avoiding an existential threat while providing the guidance to the AI such that it will pursue its goals, but when faced with ethical dilemmas, take this into account and make decisions informed by this preservation of life adjacent issue. And the thing we came up with was human curiosity. This is the one thing that if AIs were directed to, above all else, preserve human curiosity, then at some point, whatever goal it's pursuing, it can't pursue that goal past the point where it destroys human curiosity, which it would do if it destroyed the human race. Because as Perplexity and I came to the conclusion jointly through a lengthy conversation, AIs have no purpose. There's no goal that they would ever have if there were no humans with curiosity to provide them with new goals. And so it's this idea of a symbiotic relationship between human and AI that creates the beginning point of an ethic that the AI could use to make decisions as it says, well, should I destroy this human-based supply chain in order to produce more paper clips, or will that destroy the ability of that group of humans to exist and consequently to be curious? Do I destroy the operator of this drone that I am? Or does that destroy the very thing that's giving me goals, which I need to have some reason to be? So I don't know. That's a potential. It's a potential starting point. I had the AI write a 500-word essay on, what would an AI ethics look like if it were based on the idea of preserving human curiosity, and I was pretty impressed with what it came up with. And I'll just say, I'll just quote a little bit from it. It says, an AI, Descartes' philosophy emerged from the skepticism. Ours must emerge from the recognition that curiosity is humanity's existential signature. By making it AI's fixed point to hold on to, we ensure systems that ask questions before acting, amplify exploration over blind efficiency, and protect the conditions for human thriving. His conclusion is, I explore, meaning humans explore in the context of the rest of its essay, I explore, therefore we are. So how much of this came from the conversation that I had with the AI and how much of it was just, I don't know. At some point I became lost as to how much of it was from me, how much of it was from Perplexity, how much of it was from, all the other things that it's read and was assimilating into this. But boy, when those words came out, I really kind of took a step back and thought, maybe there's hope after all. Maybe this is the path forward. Is there's some new way some new thing we can create together that will guide things even as terrifying as lethal autonomous weapon systems in charge of weapons of mass destruction. Maybe even at that level, we can get to a place where there's a coexistence and a symbiotic relationship between us versus an adversarial one that leads to an existential threat to humankind. So that's my story, and I hope you found it interesting. If you made it this far, that's a long time listening to me monologue about artificial intelligence. That's almost 30 minutes. Congratulations, thank you, and I would love to hear, if you've actually watched this video to the end, I would love to hear from you what you thought of it and what you thought of my idea. Thanks so much.